Alrighty. Welcome everybody to part 3 of our 5-part Talking About Israel series. Today's session is entitled Narratives of Palestinian Nationalism, and it will be hosted by Dr Bren Carlill, the Director of Public Affairs at the Zionist Federation of Australia. Bren has had a comprehensive history of working in the field of international relations. He previously worked at the Australian Department of Home Affairs and the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. He's also worked as a policy analyst at the Australia-Israel Jewish Affairs Council and as a Foreign Press Liaison at the Palestinian Media Watch. Of course, none of this would be possible without the continued generosity of our supporters, so we thank them for that. And similar to last week, we will have time for questions at the end of the session, so if there are any questions, please comment them in the comment section of the video. With that said, I'm going to hand it off to Bren to start part 3 of Talking About Israel. Bren, over to you.
Thanks, Joseph. Thank you. So tonight's about Palestinian nationalism and the Palestinian narratives. And it might be a bit odd that I'm doing tonight's presentation. After all, I work at the Zionist Federation of Australia. And indeed, as Joey just said, much of my non-government work over the past 20-odd years has been involved in the Zionist endeavor in one way or another. I can imagine if some Palestinians or Palestinian supporters were to see my name next to the title of this presentation, they might do a bit of a double take, and that's fair enough. But what I've come to realize over the years is that Zionists should understand the Palestinian narrative, and they should understand the Palestinian perspective. And this is not so much so we can undermine their narrative or win arguments. And I'm not trying to create some sort of false moral equivalency between the two narratives. I mean, there are many parts of the Palestinian narrative that I reject, and there are certain values that are celebrated in Palestinian culture which are wrong. No, there's two reasons why Zionists, in my opinion, should understand the Palestinian narrative. And one is, if we want a sophisticated understanding of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, we need to understand the Palestinian side. Because if we don't, and if we only understand the Israeli side, then we're only going to have a one-dimensional understanding of the conflict. And the second reason is possibly a bit more important. If there is ever going to be an Israeli-Palestinian peace, and I'm talking a fundamental, society-wide, ground-up peace, then that will only happen when each side understands the narratives and perspectives of the other side. Now, I'm sure many people might instantly say, well, there's not too much evidence of Palestinians and their supporters seeking to understand the Zionist narratives, and that may well be true, but that shouldn't stop us understanding the Palestinian side. So that's what I'll be doing this evening. What I'm going to do is divide this up into 3 roughly equal sections of about 20 minutes each. For the first 20 minutes, I'm going to be talking about the evolution of Palestinian identity and the Palestinian narrative. Now, I'll be, covering 70 or 80 years in about 20 minutes, so you'll have to excuse a fair few generalizations thrown in there. In the second 20 minutes, I'm going to be talking about the Oslo peace process, and particularly what Palestinians expected out of the process, and then what they perceived was the result of the Oslo process, because that's a really good window into understanding the situation moving forward beyond 2000 when the process broke down. And then finally, for the last 20 minutes, we'll open up for questions and hopefully be able to engage. And I might add, look, if there are any questions about what I'm saying as I go along, please, as Joey said, write them in as comments. And if we run out of time at the end, then I'm very happy for you to engage me directly in some other way, and we can continue the conversation. Right, so the evolution of Palestinian identity. As I think you heard last week, nationalism is a European construct. The idea of nationalism was essentially unheard of in the Middle East, until like the late 19th century, early 20th century. Certainly there were identities in the Middle East. There was tribal identity, there was religious identity, but not the national identity that nationalism speaks to. Now, this started changing as in the 19th century, as European nationalism and those ideas were starting to come across via various intellectuals into the Middle East. But it really, it kicked in a lot in after the 1908 Young Turk Revolution in the Ottoman Empire. Most of you probably know, the Ottoman Empire covered the Middle East and was centered in what is today Turkey. So as a result of the Young Turk Revolution, ethnic Turks started to get positions of advantage, and they were advantaged as a result of this. And there's a simple concept in nationalist studies that enmity sharpens ethnic boundaries. And so when ethnic Turks started to get advantages, then people who weren't Turks started to see the difference between them and the Turks. And so what you then started to get in the Middle East is increasing ethnic identity, and obviously the majority ethnicity in the Middle East is Arabs. So there was a book published in the 1930s called The Arab Awakening, and that came to be the term for this decades-long drift. And really, it didn't start in 1908, but this decade-long drift of an increasing Arab awareness and Arab nationalism in the Middle East. But then it kicked up a notch in 1916. We were in the middle of the First World War. The British and French foreign ministers, Sykes and Picot, created an agreement, commonly called the Sykes-Picot Agreement, where they basically divided the Middle East. They got together over a map and they determined which area of the Middle East would fall under British influence and which would fall under French influence. It's funny, if you look at a map of Europe, all the national borders are squiggly lines, because they follow rivers or they follow mountain ranges, because they've been created over many centuries of conflict and, of course, over natural geographical boundaries. If you look at a map of the Middle East, almost all the lines are straight, and that's because they were drawn on a map without regard to geographical feature or ethnic groups or religious groups therein. So basically what Sykes and Picot did, they artificially divided the Middle East, and then they dragged names. They created a whole bunch of artificial names, which they gave to these areas. Names like Palestine and Syria were dragged out of antiquity. Tunisia and Algeria were named after cities. So it was all artificial. But here's the funny thing: despite the fact that these borders were artificially imposed on subject populations, over time, those populations started to get national identity based on the political entities in which they now lived. And so what we see there is for the Palestinians, they, until say the late 19th century, they thought of themselves as Muslims. And then increasingly they thought of themselves as Arabs. And then increasingly they thought of themselves as Palestinians. Now, for Palestinians, it wasn't just this gradual evolution because of the Young Turks Revolution and the Sykes-Picot Agreement. It was also because of Zionism. Now, from the late 19th century, the Zionist presence, the Jewish presence in Palestine was increasing, and the Palestinians, that is the Arab Palestinians, were becoming increasingly aware of the threat that Zionists posed to them. They basically thought, and I don't think as a while, I think it took a while in society, and I'm not expert in this, but I think it took a while in society to sort of recognize the threat, but there was this sort of uncertainty and this fear of what was happening from under their feet. Now, so Palestinian identity was forming, but I don't think that by 1948 it was a strong national coherent identity. It was still based on tribes, the dominant families in Palestinian society, village level identity, that sort of thing. And I think one aspect of the weakness or the still forming national identity was the way that the society collapsed as a result of the troubles of 1948. Before the violence broke out majorly, or as the violence was increasing, many of the middle class of Palestinian families fled, and they went overseas because they could. Now, I think that this is a result of the fact that there wasn't a strong national identity. I think if that national identity was stronger, I'm pretty sure that that middle class would have stayed. But them leaving really robbed the rest of society of the leadership that they needed during the war. Either way, in 1948, Israel's War of Independence, what Palestinians call the catastrophe, or al-Nakba, about 700,000 Palestinians were made refugees. And of course, we could go into long conversations and historiographical arguments about whose fault it was, but all of there's nothing black and white in this, exaggerated rumors of what the Jews did to a particular village made other people flee in fear. Yeah. And so like, it's hard to, so in situations like that, it's very hard to divide exactly in exact numbers, but I think the broad consensus is roughly the Jewish forces kicked out about half the Palestinian refugees and about half the Palestinian refugees fled. But for our discussion, what's important is that in the Palestinian narrative, the Palestinians were blameless victims. They were all kicked out by the Jews. And this idea of being blameless victims has affected Palestinian identity and Palestinian politics ever since. For instance, as peacemaking. Palestinians will say, well, listen, we were blameless victims. You kicked us out. So it's up to you to convince us to become peaceful. It's up to you to make all the compromises, plus the Americans, plus the British, and then we might come to the party because we were blameless victims. So that whole concept has been absolutely, it's rock solid in Palestinian identity at the moment. Another thing that developed after 1948, and it developed over time, of course, was this, that Palestine was a paradise before 1948. You see in the literature and in the poetry, like this romanticization of Palestine, the gentle aroma of the jasmine blossoms, in the dusk, the summer dusk, and it's all sort of romanticism of what Palestine was before 1948. But the reality is, before the Jews started arriving, Palestine was dusty, it was sparsely populated, it was impoverished. And although the people there had identities, they did not have a cohesive Palestinian identity. And yet Palestinian narrative today basically invents this community and this coherent whole that just didn't exist. So after 1948, the Palestinians were scattered to the four winds. There were refugee camps in Lebanon and in Syria and Jordan and in Egypt. The nascent and growing Palestinian identity was obviously completely recast, and it was all about what happened in 1948 from that moment. Now, some Palestinians, in the 1950s, a group called Fatah was formed. And Fatah was formed from memory in Kuwait. There's a lot of Palestinians, left the impoverished refugee camps and to find work in the Gulf states. So Fatah was formed in the 50s, and it was all about Palestinian self-reliance, about violence as a unifying tool in order to, and obviously violence was the method to take back Palestine. And it was interesting, violence being the unifying tool, Fatah was fixated. That's probably wrong. I believe that Fatah thought that Palestinian disunity before 1948 was the reason that Palestinian society lost so badly, was certainly a reason that Palestinian society lost so badly. So Fatah really focused on Palestinian unity. And so it purposely didn't have an ideology like Marxism or Islamism or secularism or any ism that might alienate one aspect of Palestinian society. It was all about Palestinian self-reliance and violence as a tool to get rid of the Zionists. But that was Fatah in the 50s in the Gulf states. In the refugee camps, the Arab states said, listen, we will take care of the Zionists for you. Just as they said before 1948, we'll take care of the Zionists for you. They said the same thing in the lead up to 1967. And of course, 1967 was the Six-Day War. The Arab states lost badly. And for our discussion, two interesting things happened as a result of 1967. One is the Arab states increasingly gave up the fight. Yes, there was a war in 1973, but after that, 1973 was the fifth state-level Israeli-Arab war in 25 years, and there hasn't been a state-level war since that time. Now, a big reason for that is because after 1973, America guaranteed Israel's military superiority. But another big reason is the fact that the Arabs just gave up, because what they realized is it's very easy to say, we're going to destroy Israel, but it turns out it's hard to do that in reality. And so they stopped trying. They stopped trying militarily. And over time, they gradually came to realize that Israel was not going to go anywhere. And so this eventually culminated. I mean, now there's open talks and open cooperation between the Arab states and Israel. But really, it came to a head in 2002 with the Saudi Peace Initiative, and that didn't actually go anywhere, but it was the first time that the Saudis, the unofficial leaders of the Arabs, basically officially recognized the possibility of recognizing Israel. So that was one aspect of it. The other aspect is the Palestinians themselves. From 1967, and this is where Fatah comes in, they realized that they couldn't rely on the Arab states anymore. The Arabs had stuffed them around in 48 and had stuffed them around in 67. So there was this mood of Palestinian self-reliance. And so the Palestine Liberation Organization, or PLO, was founded in 1964, 3 years before the Six-Day War. But it wasn't the organization that we think of as the PLO. It was a political organization. It was set up by Nasser, the Egyptian president, and was a puppet organization that basically justified Nasser's policy on Palestinians, or really Nasser's lack of policy on the Palestinians. But after 1967, I've got a feeling 1969, but I might be slightly wrong, there was a meeting, Fatah joined the PLO, they became the dominant faction within the PLO, and Yasser Arafat became the chairman of the PLO, and he would remain in that position until he died, I think, in 2004. So the PLO was now all about violence and Palestinian self-reliance. But we can't dismiss the PLO merely as a terrorist organization. It was a terrorist organization. But it was also, as Palestinians claim, a parliament in exile. It had an executive. It had sophisticated mechanisms in the various refugee camps and in Palestinian society, holding that society together and building that society up as far as narratives go and identity and education and all the rest of it. So the PLO was a sophisticated organization, but it was also a terrorist organization. I mean, let's not forget that. Now, from 1970, and I know I'm jumping over history here, from 1970, the PLO was based in southern Lebanon, and it formed a semi-autonomous area there, which was colloquially known by others as Fatahland. And from Fatahland, the PLO would launch attacks into Israel and basically organize its activity. So in 1982, Israel invaded Lebanon, moved all the way up and besieged Beirut, and as a result of that siege, the PLO were kicked out of Beirut and they went to live in Tunis, the PLO leadership, obviously, and they moved to Tunisia. So this was where the PLO started realizing the same thing that the Arab states had realized over the past 10 years, which is it's very easy to say we're going to destroy Israel, but it's hard to actually carry that policy out. So the PLO was sitting in Tunis, gradually becoming less and less, what's the word I'm looking for? Sorry, less good, let's say, less relevant. So what happened in 1987 was the Intifada, okay? Now, the Intifada took everyone by surprise. It took the Israelis by surprise. It took the PLO by surprise. What it was the Palestinian people in Gaza and in the West Bank rising up as a pure popular uprising. Now, Israelis have always see themselves and always saw themselves as benevolent occupiers. Okay, and there is without a doubt from 1967, Israel put in sewerage works, they put in electricity, they put in running water, they created many more schools, they created universities in the West Bank and Gaza Strip, and Palestinian standard of living dramatically increased as a result of the Israeli occupation in 1967, 100% without doubt. But no matter how benevolent you are, if you're an occupier of people that want independence, then they will only see you as an occupier. And in 1987, after 20 years of occupation, the Palestinians rose up. The Palestinians living in the territories rose up. Now, the PLO, which hadn't seen this, and were actually against the sort of uprising, they were more like they wanted to continue terrorists. They suddenly realized what was happening. They were scared of losing their movement, so they got on board very, very quickly. But they also realized, so as not to lose their movement, they had to talk to the people in the territories. And they said, what do you want? And they said, we want a state. Israel's not going anywhere. You got to negotiate. And so in 1988, The PLO, or Yasser Arafat, recognized UN Resolution 181, which was the partition plan, and then a couple of weeks later recognized UN Security Council Resolution 242, which is the Land for Peace resolution. And that, by doing that, implicitly recognized Israel's right to exist. And so that was enough for the PLO to be allowed to open up an office in Washington. Peace talks that went nowhere started in Geneva in 1991 as a result of the Gulf War. Peace talks, which didn't really go anywhere, started in Madrid and then moved to Washington. But finally, in 1993, you had the Oslo peace talks and then the Oslo Agreement. And the difference is in 1992, Yitzhak Rabin was elected Israeli prime minister on the platform of peace with the Palestinians. Now, of course, there have been plenty of Israeli prime ministers that were willing and desirous of negotiating with the Arabs beforehand, but there had never been a point in history where both Palestinian leader and Israeli leader were willing to negotiate at the same time. That happened from 1992, which is why a year later there was the Oslo Agreement. So that is a very quick, rough and ready description of the evolution of Palestinian identity. What I want to talk about now is Oslo, and I want to talk about what Palestinians expected from Oslo and then what they think that they got. So what they expected is actually quite simple. They expected less occupation, they expected movement towards statehood, and they expected no corruption in the new Palestinian entity. Problem is they got the opposite of all three of those things, and by getting the opposite, not even not gaining their objectives, but getting the opposite of their objectives, it really fundamentally undermined the popular legitimacy of the peace process and, of course, those who supported the peace process. Now, might add, on the Israeli side, exactly the same thing happened. Israelis had certain expectations of Oslo, and they got the opposite, and so that undermined, on the Israeli side, the popular legitimacy of Oslo as well, which is why no one on either side at the moment many people support the idea of peace, but they're distrustful of the peace process. So let's break this down. What does less occupation mean? Well, settlements are a key symbol of the occupation in Palestinian eyes. Now, no official settlements were established during the Oslo period, but the number of settlers doubled during those 7 years. Yeah, and for Palestinians, now of course the Oslo agreements themselves are ambiguous on settlements. It doesn't say anywhere that the settlements can't increase in population, and nor does it say that the settlements can increase in population. It just merely says the settlements are a final status issue, and that neither side should unilaterally do anything to change the situation in the territories. However, the Palestinians thought, well, look, Oslo is about establishing a Palestinian state. You know, all or most of the settlements will be removed as a result of this establishment. So why is Israel allowing the settlements to increase in population so rapidly? And that, to Palestinians, was evidence that Israel wasn't serious about peace. Because you know, and I'm sure you do know, that at the start of Oslo, many Israelis were highly distrustful of the Palestinian intentions. But the same thing was true on the Palestinian side. Many Palestinians were highly distrustful of Israeli intentions and didn't think that Israel wanted peace with the Palestinians. So what else does less occupation mean? Well, checkpoints. Now, before the Oslo Agreement, there were almost no checkpoints. I've got a feeling the first internal checkpoint, as in not on the border of the West Bank, but inside the West Bank, was established in 1992, which is, you know, only a year or so before Oslo. But the irony of the Oslo Accords is it created internal boundaries within the West Bank. So in other words, so there was areas A, B, and C, right? And so, and these areas had differing levels of Israeli and Palestinian control. But in other words, if a Palestinian wanted to travel from Nablus to Hebron, then they would have to pass into and out of various areas of Palestinian and Israeli control. Now, as the security situation deteriorated, and I'll speak about the security situation in a little bit, as the security situation deteriorated, Israel put more and more checkpoints on these borders. Now, checkpoints are a great thing because they are a non-violent way to stop terrorists. Yeah, checkpoints are great. But what they also do is stop innocent Palestinians from well, it inhibits innocent Palestinians from freely traveling where they want to travel. It prevents people taking their goods to market or to shop and so on and so forth. It prevents people visiting their grandmother. The checkpoints were hated, absolutely hated, and they were seen as a key symbol of the Oslo process. And so Palestinians entering Oslo wanted less occupation, but what they felt that they got was more occupation. They got more settlers and more soldiers and the checkpoints that came with them. Now, I said they wanted movement towards statehood. So Palestinians expected that the Oslo Agreement would end in a state. Now, again, the actual agreements are ambiguous about eventual final status. It doesn't say that there would be a state, and it certainly doesn't say that there wouldn't be a state, but Palestinians were just convinced the end result of Oslo were going to be a state. But here's the thing. The Israeli and Palestinian negotiators during the Oslo negotiations were very open with each other that the end result would be a state. And so the decision to exclude state was more of a political decision. But here's the other thing. I saw a poll from 1994, which is, within the year after the first Oslo Agreement was signed, that showed a majority of Israelis expected that the end result of the peace process would be a Palestinian state. So everyone expected that the end result would be a state. Palestinians expected Oslo to have movement towards statehood. Now, what Israel was supposed to do during the interim period was three stage withdrawals from the West Bank, which would, in Palestinian eyes, leave the Palestinians in control of most of the West Bank and Israel in control of very small amounts of the West Bank. There was also going to be final status talks, which were to be started a couple of years after the process began and were to be concluded within 5 years of the process beginning. Now, all of these deadlines, one after the other, were missed. And I think Israel only in the end did about like a 1.5 withdrawals. They didn't do all three. And then, of course, in 1996, Netanyahu was elected for the first time. Now, Palestinians, and I might add not just Palestinians, are convinced that Netanyahu is against peace. And I can have a long conversation about Netanyahu's objectives and what he's clearly said and his statements and all the rest of it. But the Palestinian perspective was that he didn't want peace, and the fact that he was elected means that Israel didn't want peace either. Now, Palestinian leaders have been promising Palestinians a maximalist outcome as a result of violence for decades. They had promised the full right of return. They had promised to going back, gaining all of Palestine back, no division, all the rest of it. And this changed without warning. The Palestinians had not prepped their people for peace at all. And what that meant was, if the process was to have any chance certainly in the face of Palestinian doubts about Israeli intentions, if the process was to have any chance of retaining popular legitimacy at all, then it needed to have constant movement towards a state. And the fact that it didn't undermine legitimacy and the fact that this situation existed in the first place really shows a weakness to Palestinian leadership and how that they led their society. But that's another whole conversation. So the issue of corruption. Now, this absolutely wasn't Israel's fault. Palestinians, by 1993, Palestinians have been under Israeli occupation for 25 years. They might not like Israel, but they knew Israel. And they knew that in Israel, if you were corrupt or if you broke the law, you'd go to jail. They knew that there were regular elections. They knew that there was freedom of speech and so on and so forth. And of course, they looked around the Middle East and saw that everywhere else were kleptocratic dictatorships. And they knew what they wanted and what they didn't want. And so when the Palestinian Authority was set up, they were very clear that what they wanted was a democratic, accountable, representative government without corruption. Unfortunately, they got the exact opposite of all of those things. It's really interesting looking at Palestinian polls in the 1990s, where you see the fear of criticizing the Palestinian government among Palestinians just steadily increased throughout the Oslo process. So the corruption wasn't just financial corruption or nepotism, it was political corruption, if you like. It was a lack of freedom of speech, a lack of freedom of conscience, and all the rest of it. And so that was another reason. So the Palestinian government, which was created by the peace process and was pushing the peace process, was hated and detested by its own people. And that, I might add, remains the same today. Nothing has particularly changed. Now, corruption wasn't the only reason why the Palestinian economy stagnated. It was also because of all the closures and stuff with the checkpoints, and also a lot of Palestinians found jobs in Israel. But when the security situation was bad, Israel would close the borders so as to prevent terrorism, or particularly when they had an active intelligence alert that a terrorist attack was pending. They'd shut down the borders, and fair enough. But what that meant was Palestinian workers couldn't get into Israel, they couldn't do their job, they couldn't get paid. Again, that added to frustration. So I want to talk a little bit about Palestinian violence. Now, there is no doubt Palestinian violence increased during the Oslo period. In fact, the 7 years of the Oslo period, more Israelis were killed as a result of terrorism in those 7 years than in any other preceding 7-year period. And it wasn't just because of, slow implementation of the peace process that increased Palestinian frustration. No, because a lot of the terrorism actually spiked in 1993 before the signing of Oslo, and then 94, 95, 96 were like the highest numbers of Israeli deaths to terrorism up until that point. So that's not the case. Now, the reality is that Palestinian violence during the Oslo process was designed to undermine the peace process. So you've got this odd situation where the PLO, terrorist organization, is in peace talks with Israel, but at the same time, you've got a dramatic increase in Palestinian violence designed to undermine the peace process. And to sort of understand why that happened, we need to take a bit of a step back into objectives. Now, in Palestinian society, and for that matter in Israeli society, there are basically two broad objectives vis-a-vis the enemy. There are those who might not, there are those Palestinians who might not like Israel, but realize that Israel is not going anywhere. And so therefore the land has to be shared or divided with them in order for there to be peace, right? And there are other people, whether for religious or nationalist or other reasons, that don't want to divide the land or share it with anyone and believe that there should not be a Jewish state anywhere in Palestinian land. And of course, these people are best exemplified by Hamas and Islamic Jihad and groups like that. Now, the same thing happens on the Israeli side, right? There are people in Israel who might not necessarily like the Palestinians, but realize they're not going anywhere, and so realize they have to share or divide the land with them. And then there are others who, for religious or other reasons, don't want a Palestinian state anywhere on Jewish land. And Yigal Amir, who killed Yitzhak Rabin, was specifically, and he stated it to the police after he was arrested, was specifically trying to undermine the peace process because he didn't want a Palestinian state, right? And so they exist on both sides, but of course, proportionally, they exist much more on the Palestinian side. And so the violence in the Oslo process was conducted by groups like Hamas and Islamic Jihad that wanted to destroy Israel, and they saw Israeli-Palestinian peace or movement towards Israeli-Palestinian peace as a key threat, because peace agreements are win-win, right? But it also, even if it's only implicit, it also means a recognition of the other side's right to exist. And of course, that's anathema to groups like Hamas. So Hamas did their absolute best to undermine the process, and they did a cracking job because they succeeded. Yeah, they undermined the process. I talked before about what Palestinians expected from Oslo. The key thing that Israelis expected was less violence, but violence increased as a result of Oslo. The Oslo process lost popular legitimacy. Hamas did that, and they won, if you like, in that they defeated the threat, which was the peace process. Now, I talked before about Palestinian unity, and I think I'm a bit early, but I think I'll close on this and we can go to questions. Look, a consequence of Palestinian focus on unity is weak Palestinian leadership. Palestinian leaders haven't been able to tell the Palestinians the hard truths that they need to hear, such as the fact that the refugees won't be returning to Israel, that Israel isn't going anywhere, that Jews have as much right to the land as Palestinians, and so on. A national conversation about refugees just hasn't even started, right? So all of this is really a result of the leadership not wanting to rock the boat, okay? Because of this insistence on unity above all else, and it's become this weird maxim, and it's inhibited them from showing leadership, okay? But what it actually does is it resulted them in producing internally inconsistent messages. The Palestinian government and the PLO were in peace talks with Israel, but at the same time they were pushing maximalist myths like the right of return for Palestinians and so on and so forth. And what that effectively did was decrease support for the leaders and increase support for a group like Hamas, because Hamas was internally consistent. It didn't change its line. It's like, we hate the Jews, we're going to kill the Jews, and they did. Yeah, and so that the Palestinian, the PLO leaders really shot themselves in the foot with this internally inconsistent messaging in the aim of unity, and in the end, what they actually got was increased disunity. So that's again, it's a pretty quick rundown of Oslo, but I think I'll leave it there. That gives us plenty of time for questions, and see how we go. Joey.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks for that. I'm just going to get my video back on. Perfect. Awesome. Thanks for that amazing insight and that kind of jump through history of Palestinian nationalism. We've got quite a few questions on the board. A number are to do with, I guess, how Palestinian nationalism has shifted into the modern day, and a couple about, I guess, the foundational ideology. We might start with a question that was asked prior to the event, and also, I guess, in another way again in the comments. So there are obviously a number of positive elements of Palestinian nationalism, but do you think that they are not sometimes offset by the more negative elements, specifically the idea that Palestinian nationalism is a response to Zionism or the reliance on things like anti-Semitism?
I don't know if you could say it's offset. Ultimately, it doesn't matter. Palestinian nationalism is what it is. Yeah? What Zionism was a result, that is the nationalist concept of Zionism was a result of European anti-Semitism. Yeah, and of course it was based on the long-held cultural religious concept of one day, Mashiach willing, returning to Eretz Israel. But Zionism was a result of negative things. Yeah, and so the fact that Palestinian identity developed internally, but then developed as a result of the perceived threat of Zionism, and the fact that they have anti-Semitism, I think all those negative things, and really, a key concept I find appalling in Palestinian, or aspects of Palestinian society, is the focus on both victim mentality and also martyrdom. And I think these hold these hold back the Palestinians from achieving statehood. But it is what it is. I come from a white Christian Western background, and I have my perspectives, sort of based on that, and Palestinians come from a different background, and so their perspectives are formed by that. So I'm not sure that I could really I'd want to comment so much on the negatives and positives. It's more about, well, this is what it is. Ultimately, I think Palestinians, Israel's not going anywhere. Palestinians need to accept that, and accept that down to their innermost being. And only when they have accepted that, they don't have to like Israel, but only when they have accepted that Israel is not going anywhere, then I think we could move forward.
Awesome. There's a number of questions around, I guess, the ideology, as well as how or where the best chance at securing a Palestinian state and the idea of Palestinian nationalism is going to come from in the modern day. Obviously, the ideal of Palestinian unity seems to resonate still quite strongly. However, many Palestinians are dispersed politically, geographically, across the globe, which for many people complicates the actual process of Palestinian nationalism. Do you see the best chance for a Palestinian state coming from inside or outside of the West Bank?
Well, there's two answers to that. The first is pretty brief, in that the world's Jewish community is dispersed across the world, but Zionism doesn't have a problem, even though Jews are everywhere. And so the fact that Palestinians live everywhere, I don't see really a problem. As far as internally, Palestinians in the West Bank in particular are just more pragmatic. for a variety of reasons. Certainly more pragmatic than Gazan Palestinians and much more pragmatic than diaspora Palestinians. And part of that is because they live there. They see, they see the reality of Israel. They also see the reality of, if Palestinian, says, the leadership says, go and throw rocks at Israel and throw bombs at Israel and shoot them, then the people that live in the West Bank, know what the consequences are of that, right? Whereas the people that live in a Lebanese refugee camp can have all their juices stirred up and go marching in the street and say, kill the Jews, but they don't have to live with the consequences of that. And so I think part of living with those consequences that, and look, I read a great quote, Dan Meridor, who was, used to be a Knesset member for a while. He once said, look, in the negotiations, this is even before Oslo, he said this to Dennis Ross, who was, an American negotiator. He said, look, we're fine living with the West Bank PLO, but we can't live with the external PLO. And he said the West Bank PLO want to discuss 1967, whereas the external PLO want to discuss 1948. They want to discuss the right of return, the refugees, the very existence of Israel, and all of those sort of issues. Whereas the West Bank Palestinians were like, listen, let's finish the occupation, let's establish a state, let's move on. So yeah, I think the greatest hope for Palestinians is internal, and I think it is. West Bank versus Gaza, but for that matter, Israel was established by the Jews that moved to Eretz Israel, the Yeshuv, but they were also established with a lot of political and financial help from abroad. And I think once all aspects of Palestinian society get a bit more serious about pragmatically pursuing peace, I think they'll need both the external and internal elements of society.
Yeah, that might lead well into the next two questions we have. The first one is about the idea of, I guess, the circles of actors that are now involved in Palestinian nationalism are, for many fortunate and unfortunate reasons, no longer just the Palestinians. You've obviously got Israel as a major player in that equation, also the wider Arab world, as well as now almost the entire globe. How much of an impact do you see all of those circles of actors involved in that situation playing on the situation itself?
Well, look, I think all of those actors have always been involved from day one. UN partition plan and constant UN resolutions and so on and so forth. The Arab states, all the rest of it. But I think the Palestinians made a strategic decision approaching 10 years ago to fundamentally internationalize the dispute. And I think they did this because, through various negotiations, the mixture of, look, Palestinians, you talk to a pragmatic Palestinian, and they will know what a peace process will look like. And, it will look very like 95% the same as what a pragmatic Zionist will say what a peace process or a peace agreement will look like. Okay, there's a few differences around the edges, but broadly speaking, everyone knows what an eventual Palestinian state and Israeli-Palestinian agreement will be, right? So that's great. So Palestinians know the compromises that they have to make, and likewise, Israel knows the compromises they have to make, and that's great. The problem is the Palestinian leadership is fundamentally weak. It has no political capital. Now, if you're going to make fundamental changes to your society or to your narrative, you know what, fellas, actually the refugees aren't going to come home. That's a big fundamental change to Palestinian society. If you're going to make a compromise like that, you're going to need a lot of political capital, a lot of goodwill among your people to make that compromise. And the Palestinian leadership doesn't have that. They are detested by the Palestinians. So they basically come to this impasse where they can't go into negotiations because they're not willing to make the compromises that they know they need to make. So what do? Okay, they started getting bad press because in 2000 and 2001 and 2009 and 2014, it was the Palestinians that walked out of the negotiations without, and Israel or the Americans offered an agreement or offered a set of parameters, and the Palestinians either didn't respond at all or said no every time without offering a counter proposal. And that's the key. Palestinians are more than welcome to say no to an agreement that they don't like, but you'd expect them to offer a counter offer, and they never did. Right? So Palestinians were getting bad press, okay, about the fact that they keep on walking out. So what do? Well, they internationalize it. They go to the UN and become that they get their status increased at the UN. It's a very friendly environment. They join all these other organizations out there. They join the International Criminal Court, and they do all of this because what this does is create pressure against Israel for maintaining the occupation. Okay, even though Israel actually can't end the occupation, they can't end the occupation through negotiations because the Palestinians won't negotiate, and they can't end the occupation unilaterally because you'll probably get another Gaza. So Israel can't end the occupation, but they're getting increased pressure from the international community, care of what the Palestinians have been doing very, very successfully because they've maintained the occupation, right? And so this current tactic of the Palestinian has been really successful for the Palestinians. And so why would they stop it? Why would they go back to negotiations when they're getting great press, when all the pressure is on Israel now? This is where the international community has allowed this to happen. And now, like, we've got, it's such a hard, complex hole that everyone has dug themselves into. I can't sort of see how it's going to be resolved, but either way, that's where we are now. I think I've drifted from your question about the complexity of the international actors. Yeah, well, it's become more and more complex, but that's, I think, because the Palestinians have made the decision to walk away from negotiations and to engage those international actors.
Yeah. So jumping to the next question, I guess, you talked in the answer to the previous question about the assistance that Israel and Zionists had in the creation of a state, from international support. We've obviously seen with the election of Donald Trump, and there's been a steady cutoff of private and public American aid to Palestine, as well as to the United Nations Relief and Works Agency. What kind of impact do you think that plays in Palestinian nationalism and the eventual securement of a Palestinian state?
I think it just confirms, Palestinians have never trusted the Americans. Even Obama wasn't really trusted by the Palestinians. And so when Trump does stuff like that, they're like, well, look, see, we were right all along. I don't think it really makes a difference. If UNRWA doesn't get money, then that's not going to prevent the establishment of a Palestinian state. It's not going to cause the creation of a Palestinian state either. The Palestinian state, it's very complex. And going back to narratives, right? The Israeli narrative regarding the Palestinian refugees, the Israeli narrative for the first 30 odd years of Israel's existence was that all the Palestinians ran away by themselves, or that they were told to leave by the Arabs, and then with the new historians, Benny Morris and the rest of them, there was an eventual realization among Israelis and an acceptance among Israelis that actually no, our forces had a role in sending out the Palestinians, making them refugees. And which is not to say that Palestinians, and frankly, nor me, think that Israel was necessarily bad doing this. I mean, there was military necessity and so on and so forth. I mean, and yes, happy to go into a long, detailed conversation about that. But still, there is an Israeli military responsibility, even if not a moral responsibility or moral blame for Israel for helping to create the Palestinian right. So my point being, the Israeli narrative changed about Palestinian refugees. The Palestinian narrative about the refugees hasn't changed, okay? But here's the thing, the Israeli narrative changed when Israel was 30 years old. It had won difficult wars, 48, 67, in a sort of in its own and different way, 73. It no longer had any real existential threats against it. And so it was able to really start tackling the difficult questions, start challenging their own national myths and their national narratives, right? The Palestinians have yet to create a state. and they're a highly nationalist community, and I can't see them really challenging and tackling their own national myths and their national narratives. But they need to change that narrative if they're going to create a state, because the refugees aren't going to go back to Israel. And so it's a really interesting and difficult situation that they've got there. It's hard.
Jumping into a question from the comments. As part of any Israeli-Palestinian peace settlement, how do you think Israel may need to deal with the claims of Palestinian refugees? So building on from what you were speaking about just then.
Well, look, I mean, what to do with the refugees goes in the continuum to, suck it up, but to let's have lots and lots come. Look, I don't know. I'm not close enough to all the negotiations to know what the real answer is. I think, what has been proposed in the past is X number of thousands of Palestinians will be allowed to immigrate to Israel and presumably those people will have family in Israel, so it'll be a family reunification thing. Of course, like Israel and the right of return to Jews, Palestinians will have a right of return to the state of Palestine when it's established, no problem. Obviously, there'll have to be billions of international dollars in compensation to Palestinians who will retain. The international community are going to have to twist the arms of the Arab states to do something with the many thousands of disgruntled Palestinians that live in their borders, particularly Lebanon. They'll have to probably, I don't know what will happen there. But I think the main and the really tricky, difficult thing will be the Palestinians are looking for Israel to say, actually, sorry, it was our fault. And Israelis are not going to say that. And so there's going to have to be some very tricky legal language there to find for Israel to accept some responsibility without actually, but keeping true to Israel's own self of, ultimately it wasn't Israel's fault. The Arab states picked a fight with Israel. Israel won. The refugees were a very, very unfortunate outcome of that conflict, but we didn't start it. So how they find that language, I think, will be probably the trickiest.
Yep. A bit of a larger question. Many refer to the divide between the ideologies of the leadership currently in the West Bank and in the Gaza Strip, each becoming almost, I guess, entrenched within their respective territories. And there's often a strong view that this division in many ways contributes to a decline in their actual institutions. And I guess overall to the concept of Palestinian nationalism. What do you think about that?
Yeah, the fact that they're getting entrenched there is, Palestinians have attempted since 2006, since the great split, the mini coup, or whatever you want to call it, where Fatah was kicked out of Gaza. There have been numerous Palestinian attempts. Again, this goes back to unity. Numerous Palestinian attempts to reunify them, and whether or not that's to bring Hamas into the PLO or to basically dissolve Hamas security forces, or basically keep the security forces in place, but give them a badge that says PLO. There's been all these attempts, and they've always broken down. And the interesting thing is Israel, and in theory, the international community has always made clear that Hamas will not be recognized or dealt with until it recognizes Israel's right to exist and recognize previous Palestinian-Israeli agreements. And the Palestinians have attempted these unity talks, even though Hamas hasn't done that. And that would ultimately mean a fundamental obstacle vis-a-vis Israeli-Palestinian relations. It's hard to see Hamas giving up power, frankly. And Fatah is suitably hated in Gaza, that there's not going to be a popular uprising in Gaza to overthrow Hamas. And Hamas, if you go back through the news, in 2006, when Hamas took over, they then started picking fights with some of the key groups in Gaza. You might remember there were big gun battles. This is after Fatah was kicked out, between certain families, dominant families in Gaza, and some of these families were synonymous with various Islamist organizations. But Hamas picked fight with them one after another and killed them. to entrench its position. It was very brutal, very well, efficient way of making sure it retained power. So Hamas isn't going anywhere. Whether Fatah is going anywhere, that's a different matter. It's commonly believed or commonly said that the PA, and therefore Fatah, has only retained its position in the West Bank because Israel is there, and that they would be turfed out the minute Israel left. You know, people that know more than me say that, so you know, I presume it's true or close to true. Yeah, but there's no answer, and certainly it makes life difficult. You know, and then I think the Obama, the 2014 peace talks, they were basically only talking about the West Bank, and they're sort of, in theory, talking about Gaza, but knowing that what they were trying to negotiate wouldn't involve Gaza because only the West Bank would implement it. So it's almost as if people have realized that Hamas is a permanent entity there, or Hamas-run Gaza is a permanent entity. The good news, I guess, is that Gaza is on Israel's periphery. You know, the towns close to Gaza are not, well, not important, strategically speaking. Whereas the West Bank abuts Israel's industrial, commercial, and population centers. And so were the West Bank to become run by Hamas, then that, with a commitment to engage in regular violence that Hamas does, that would be a very, very significant thing. So it's good that Fatah remained in West Bank. And frankly, if Hamas want to stick around in Gaza, I don't think it really matters. I mean, yes, there'll be occasional war and stuff, but it's not like an existential threat to Israel that a Hamas-run Gaza would start to look like. Sorry, Hamas-run West Bank would start to look like.
So I guess we're hitting the hour mark, so we might wrap it up there. I'd like to thank everyone that joined us tonight for our third Talking About Israel. A big thank you to Dr. Bren Carlill for taking the time to share his knowledge with us. And as always, a massive thank you to all of our supporters for their continued generosity. So as a reminder, this was only number 3 of 5 in the Talking About Israel event series. We'll be back again next Tuesday at 7:30 p.m. We're going to discuss the concepts of war and peace with Sam Tataka. So once again, thank you to everyone that came tonight, and looking forward to seeing you all next week.